to do a little more introduction. My name is Craig Cohron. Our family farm is about 15 miles in that direction, so I didn't have to travel here very far this morning. So that mileage, I'm definitely not an expert here. So this is just a discussion here. When Jimmy asked me a few months back what or to describe our baleage operation, I thought about it, and we're just going to describe what we do on our farm, and I just scratched down some notes here. Get rid of that. I don't even like those. Okay, so first of all, we cut at a.
Let me just stick this one on here so we get good.
I usually don't ever even use one.
This is just for the.
We're done making racket now. Okay, all right. First of all, we're going to cut at a proper stage of maturity. Now, what are we cutting? Most of the time on our farm making baleage, we are using an annual program, whereas in the winter we have a multitude of crops planted right now. We have some winter forage oats, we've got triticale, ryegrass, and then combinations of all three of those species together in the same field. We are also using Timothy as an annual on our farm. I think that quit working. We started using Timothy a few years ago because we were needing a wider harvest window. We really enjoy that because we're able to still make good quality baleage on into the middle of May. So of the crops that we're going to use, we're going to cut them at the proper stage of maturity, as well as sorghum Sudan. If there's any questions for sorghum Sudan later, we use a lot of them on our farm, mostly the brachytic dwarf sorghum Sudan. As far as cutting, the actual mechanics of what we do, we try to cut after the dew comes off in the morning. And a lot of guys say you're using a disc machine. It really doesn't matter. Just cut anytime you want to. Cut in the evening. Cut whenever. But I prefer to cut just as the dew comes off, and I want to cut as much hay as I can roll in 2 hours before we eat lunch. So we're running some fairly large swath or machinery to cut. We're running one 10-foot and one 14-foot Moco to accomplish this. The thought process behind that is we're going to get it down. We want to get rid of the dew so that we're relatively dry as far as the plant material. Then we want to lay it down where we have full access to sun. So we're cutting it. We're wide swathing everything. In fact, the John Deere Moco, we've actually disassembled part of it to try to get the tail end of it opened up enough to try to get to that 80% mark. We've had issues with that one trying to get the mat spread wider beyond the wheels. So we've done some fabrications with some angle iron and fins and different things, but that has been a challenge with those wider mowers. And then our goal after cutting, and a lot's going to be dictated based off of ground conditions. How usually in the spring when we're in late April, we're fighting wet soil conditions, but we try to get the material cut, wilted down to that 60-65% moisture range before the sun sets that evening. And sometimes we will ted just after lunch if we've mowed before lunch. Sometimes if the ground's a little heavy, we'll wait till the next morning. But typically we do ted, and I would never suggest to anyone that's making baleage to tighten your turkey tails up on the back of the mower and throw it into a windrow, pick it up with a baler. That is, in my opinion, that is a terrible thing to do, especially in our climate, where we've got moisture soil conditions in late April and May. I've got friends in Missouri that struggle with dry conditions underneath their hay in northwest Missouri, and they do swath and pick up directly with the baler. But I've not seen a situation where that's been a good plan here in Kentucky. Then shoot for, as far as how much do we dry, I shoot for the lower side of the moisture spectrum, in that 45% moisture range. However, most of the time when we go for that, we all get in a hurry. A lot of times I'll be in that 55, 60% range when my goal is 45. I think when Dr. Henning come out to our farm in the fall, I told him, oh, it's a little heavy up there. It's probably pushing 60, and what were we? We were 62 or 3 or something like that with his fancy moisture meter. But there again, yes, that's wet, but that was still hay that was cut, it was wilted, it was scattered, and then it was re-raked, and we were still at that 60% moisture range. It was fairly high quality feed, best you remember, too. Running right at 180 RFQ, and we've been feeding that to feeder calves all winter. And then perfect windrows make better bales. And these are some notes that I was making when some of the other speakers were speaking. To make that really tight bale with when we're running a 568 John Deere roller with the silage kit on it. So nothing, it's a dry hay baler. It'll do wet, whatever. But what we have found to make good, high quality, high density bales, we need a uniform windrow. We try to make the windrows nearly as wide as the bale chamber or less than half the width of the bale chamber, so that if you do have to weave, we're wanting to keep a good solid mat. As far as how we rake, we have used a Vermeer twin bar rake for several years. We've never operated a ground drive rake on our farm, but I have purchased a rotary rake. We were needing something to handle a smaller swath, because the V barred rake and heavy high producing baleage behind your mocos were putting too much material into the baler too fast. We were having issues, especially with sorghum Sudan, where our travel distance wasn't great enough to get enough revolutions on the baler. So to make those tight, high density bales, I'd like to at least be traveling forward 45 seconds or so before we kick a bale out, or before we tie a bale. And as far as baler speed, personally, we usually run pretty fast in the field, and we're running closer to high RPM on the balers, our baler, and then wrap quickly. When I first started with baleage, we were thinking we had to be within 2 hours or whatever. Our motto has always been, don't bale any more today than you can get wrapped before you go to bed. And we'll work into the evening getting hay wrapped. And you just kind of got to learn your limits on your farm. There have been times when we were doing sorghum Sudan that the temperature would get so high, you're talking 100-degree air temp outside, and we would bale so many rolls and then stop, because we kind of have a limited crew. It's me and another guy, and Dad might be around there to help. So anyway, know your limitations, and if you're making bales faster than you can get them wrapped, there's nothing wrong with just letting it, stop the baler, wrap the feed that you've already got rolled, and then regroup. And then just a tip, as far as, and this gets back into like sorghum Sudans, I have found that the coarser stemmed forages, like the BMR sorghum Sudans that we use, need a little bit longer cook time, or I'm calling the cook time, that fermentation time. That may be more of a dairy term, but anyway, it seems like the longer that they stay in the wrap, the better they feed, and the better the livestock utilize all of the material. And then I made a note earlier as far as wraps, and we were talking about lower moisture baleage, because we've put up a lot that was in the 35-40% range. Drier forage needs more wraps than wetter forage. If a flock of, or I don't even know what you call it. You got geese and different. What is a flock of buzzards? You know, we've had trouble with buzzards in the past, but when you have birds of any a murder, maybe. Okay, but anyway, we have had issues just randomly. You know, birds would come in and tear up plastic and that sort of thing. Hopefully, it happens during the wintertime or late fall when you're getting ready to start feeding the feed anyway. But them coming in on a drier feed makes me more nervous than a wetter feed, because the wetter feed actually has the ability to kind of seal off in places, but like drier feed need more wraps so that we're not getting that air infiltration in, where the wetter feed has the ability to kind of heal itself a little bit. And that is all the notes that I made. Any questions before we move along to?
Any specific questions for Craig with what he's talked about and with how he's doing it, Chris?
Remember one time shortly after I came to Kentucky, we had a little field day at your house.
Mm-hmm.
Where we had a bad fermentation on one silage. I don't know if you remember that or not. It was I think it was really rancid.
That must be
What?
another farm, Chris.
Way too wet. It may have not. That may have not been. And I remember that field day. And you know, I've been wrapping hay since 2007, I believe. And we've made some really bad feed, and we've made some really good feed. That's part of the process, is learning. So there may have been. And if there was rancid feed, my guess is that it was probably cut over mature. It was probably baled too wet. Was really wet. Okay. So I've heard people say, well, I can't do baleage because I don't have a silage baler. And I'm here to tell you, I've put up some rancid feed back in the day with a 535 John Deere, and they were not sold as a silage baler. So, you know, you're a typical machinery this day and time will handle 55, 45 to 55% moisture. That's been my experience.
Chris, I think you baled that extra wet just to show for the field day. Yeah, that's right. Other questions for what Craig talked about, practically how he does it?
Okay. Okay. How do I say this nicely? Okay. Experience comes from some good practical research too. I've played around with the electronic moisture sensor or gauges. The one that I had maxed out at like 45%, which was of very little use in baleage. When Dr. Henning was down back in the fall, he had one that was temperature compensated, which I think that was the temperature compensation allowed for the higher moisture range. Being from a background where I've worked with a lot more dairy farmers when I'm not wearing the farmer hat instead of the seed hat, I'm used to being around like a Koster type moisture tester. And on baleage, you know, the way that I would gather a sample would be go out into the field and you kind of got to make a ball out of it, put it down in your drying oven. I've never used the oven or the microwave method. I've always had the tester that had, or the dryer that has it's like a hair dryer that's blowing up through a baking sifter thing for I don't know, I've seen Mom use them. I don't know exactly what you call it. But anyway, that thing's gone, and then the air blows up through the screen. And, you know, it's just it's just math. You know, you put 100 grams in, you dry it down till it quits losing weight. What you've got left is your dry matter percent. And if you're interested in what moisture is, you just take 100 and subtract the dry matter percentage. Jim.
Since you don't do that now, give me a rule of thumb for spring cuttings, summer cuttings, and crop. How long do you wait to harvest?
Typically, if this is really wet forage that's high moisture content when cut, you know, immature, I'm going to have to cut that morning. I'm going to let it lay the entire day. The next day, I'm going to ted, and then on the third day, we're going to make hay. And that makes pretty stuff. Anybody that's operating, this just gets in my little circle here. Anybody working a day ahead of me is probably putting up some feed that's a little too wet. Now, as we get farther advanced in maturity, with small grains or even ryegrass, where that crop itself is becoming more mature, some of that in-growth type, that moisture that's in the plant, the moisture content of the plant's actually going to be less. And that's going to decrease the amount of time that it would take to make good baleage. But from what we have learned, if we will now leaving it out there into a narrow windrow, you're going to make some junk. Where we're helping our forage is when it's scattered out wide, it's exposed to the sun. We've actually put up a lot of feed in the last 3, 4, 5 years that has had double-digit water soluble sugars. So we're very happy with that. And when we can get double-digit sugar numbers, our cattle are really going after it. And sugar is energy. It worked well. Put weight on you or give you energy. I think it just puts weight on me. This one? Okay.
If you look at the forage crop pocket guide that Irrigation and others put out, it talks about this hand technique to tell the moisture. This is talking about in chop silage. If you squeeze it into a ball in your hand and juice comes out, it's over 75%. If you squeeze the ball in your hand and your hand's just damp, but it's a little bit wet, and the ball holds shape at 70 to 75. 60 to 70 if it makes a ball but it kind of comes apart and there's no free juice. And then below 60, it doesn't stick together. Now, making baleage, obviously you don't have that same thing, but if you take making baleage, the same kind of thing holds true, that if you take a handful of material and you wring it like you're wringing a dish rag, if you're squeezing juice out, then it's typically over 75%. You're going to get into botulism stuff. If you wring it out and your hands are damp, that's 70 to 75%. And when you get down below 70, it's hard for that kind of technique to work. But if you wring it, then it just bounces back, and that's starting to get into the low 60s. So there's a lot of crude techniques, but definitely if your hands are wet when you're wringing that stuff, whether it's chopped or whether it's in a stimmy thing, then you need to let it dry down some more. The other thing that I've forgotten about this, Purdue put out a kind of a Coster tester like unit you could build from some metal ductwork and hook up a hair dryer to it. And we made one of those at work because it's a little clunky. But if anybody wants to get the plans, I'll send them to you. Just check with me, give me your address, or give me your email, and I'll send those to you.
And I will say that the first feed of the year that we put up, which is usually annual ryegrass that we're shooting for, the kind of quality that we're going to use for our feeder calf and the weaning operation, I will be a whole lot more particular with that, and I will use the tester. So I'm not going to stand up here and say I never turn it on, but it just gives.
Sure that's not too wet, I guess. That early spring stuff.
We have had more trouble putting it up too wet, and very rarely will we ever put up annual ryegrass in April that it doesn't need to lay there till the third day to get it into that safe range. Now I will say this with sorghum Sudan, I've went in on farms in my seed consultant side of my what I do, where it's like, what's wrong with my feed? And it's like, oh, I cut the sorghum Sudan down, I baled it the next day. That's what I'm supposed to do. It's baleage, right? And you could just the butyric acid just reeks of butyric acid and that sort of thing. So, with sorghum Sudan, a lot of times we'll let it lay there. We have let it lay for 3 and 4 days, at times, and then when we go in and roll it, moisture, the sample will come back from the laboratory, you know, for forage quality, and we'll still be in that 55, 60 range. Even though that plant, that stalk looks like it's really starting to dry down, that's not an alarming thing that makes you just run out there and just get it rolled real fast. You still got some time because those plants retain moisture very well in the stalk.
That early spring stuff, like maybe a small grain, wheat or triticale, you might need to let it go 2 or 3 days. Mm-hmm. Same with the annual ryegrass. Yep. But get into the summer, then it's going to go pretty quick. It's maybe going to dry quicker than you want it to.
Later spring, where you're taking, you know, oats or triticale or something like that, when you start seeing that total plant moisture go down, it's gonna start going on you a lot quicker. And then sorghum Sudan, you know, there's just so much moisture retained in the stalk that you've kind of got to watch that. It's almost like a spring cut, cool season grass, because, you know, it likes the summertime. That's what that plant. That's why it's so efficient, is because it can do a lot with very little water.
Any other general questions before we get into some discussion? Jessica, do you want to go through some practical tips, or you just want to come up and follow up with some questions? Do you have another speech, or do you want to come up and... Okay.
Yep. I could talk all day if you want. I thought we were just doing a...
So if you guys don't mind sitting here.
I could have had a PowerPoint if you wanted one, but I just didn't.
I'd much rather you just tell us like you do it.
Yeah, I think
we're just going to sufficient. We don't need to go all of things. But anything you have, you just kind of say, this doesn't make sense to me, or you give me a bit more detail. We'll give them a chance to answer that. And we'll be glad to follow up with any of you or talk to your local.
You guys pass this back and forth so we can get good sound when you talk.
I wish a lot of this would
just put it on the ground.
Precise, but we're dealing with the environment. We're dealing with plants.
Get a chair. Lay on the chair.
We're kind of telling you the best we can.
Lay over in the chair.
Okay. Okay, open it up to the floor, Jimmy.
Both of you, tell me how to make a really dense bale. As many scenarios as you can.
And
I'm taking notes.
Repeat the question, and that'll help with the report.
Okay, he was asking how to make a really dense bale. Do you want to talk about your baler first? Tell us about your baler.
This is going to sound crazy, but I drive really fast. The baler that we run likes to be run at about 3/4, RPM. We're running a baler set up on 1,000 RPM, and we're running a relatively fast speed because the hydraulic tensioning mechanism. A lot of times when guys start going really slow, the bleed off on it may be bleeding off faster than they think it is. So we try to make sure that the little needle is buried very deeply into the red.
So I was also going to say make sure the needle is into the red. But obviously, whenever you're talking about baler type, as I touched on earlier, if you have the opportunity to run a variable chamber versus a fixed chamber, that in and of itself is going to be a game changer in terms of bale density. And all of them are different in terms of settings, but like on our balers, we have like 1 to 10, and we recommend turning it up to 10, which I think is like a 2,000 PSI, I think. Like in terms of like on your monitor, in terms of density settings, it's like just a relative value, right? And so it allows you then to know when you're in a certain crop, maybe I want to turn it on 8, or if I'm doing dry hay, maybe I want to do it on a 7, or whatever the case may be. But that's going to be the most obvious answer, is if you're in the market for another baler, think about upgrading from a fixed chamber to a variable chamber. Another thing to think about if you're talking about baler types is something with knives in it, because the smaller your theoretical length of cut is going to be, the denser the pack. it's going to be the same thing in something in a bunk, like a corn silage or something like that. The smaller your length of cut, the less air can get in between each of those particles. So once again, that's also another opportunity, and I'll try not to get into like my soapbox in terms of animal performance, but that's also another opportunity if you do have poorer quality forage to try and improve the overall performance of your livestock that are eating that. It's to reduce the overall length of cut, so it's in turn going to allow that rumen to have more microbial activity and digest that crop a lot better than if you're feeding a long stem crop.
Might be a question for you, later in the season when the crop mass is less, thinking about whether you fed this grass clover mix or alfalfa mix. I know rapid dry down is important to save the sugars versus running a tedder and have leaf shatter and less compaction on the soil, less man hours. How do you look at not tedding that hay late in the fall when it's light? It's going to dry pretty quickly.
Follow up on that, guys, and I'll leave it.
Sure, so I think a lot of that's
Repeat the
going.
question.
Oh, he was talking about the effects of not tedding in the fall. And so I think that a lot of that is going to depend on just your environmental conditions. A lot of times in the fall, it's going to be really difficult to get dry. But also, I think that that's going to be a good opportunity for you just to let it dry down. Did you have a follow-up question?
No, I just the cost benefit of sacrificing one for the other, leaf shatter versus rapid slow dry down.
I mean, that's $1 million question, right? So I mean, it's probably just going to be a give and take, because the slow dry down, you're just going to get a reduction in forage quality. With leaf shatter, you're going to get a reduction in forage quality. But with tedding, and whenever you're talking about leaf shatter, it has to do with the percent moisture of the crop. So if you can ted it, if your soil is dry enough, and if you can ted it whenever that crop moisture is high enough, you're not going to get leaf shatter.
You said maybe about 40%, Jessica, would it be a number you would?
I would say maybe a little bit higher than that.
But if you're getting any leaf shatter, then in my mind, it's not worth taking.
Exactly. I think if you're getting leaf shatter with tedding, don't do it. Tedding should be used as a tool to widen that swath, flatten that swath, allow sunlight to come down on it, and to dry down. But if you're getting leaf shatter, it could very well be time to rake.
Well, that question kind of sparked something that I did not bring up earlier, was that as far as fall hay, we really don't put up any fall hay. We just graze it. We we grain farm several acres there at home, so the bulk of our hay is a double crop that's put in the fall after soybeans or corn comes off. So we're making our winter's feed in the off season, or the winter crop season. So anything that is in, I'm not going to call it permanent, but perennial stand, we are going to graze that in the fall. So we're working primarily in tillable land is where we're working at putting up this baleage.
Other questions, comments, or you all have it down perfect now? Go ahead.
I got one for Jessica. On Hanco's roller conditioners, what do y'all think about the full contact conditioners that you see in the marketplace?
Yeah. So.
What's your own research on that?
Yeah, so he was asking about like the full contact intensive conditioning systems is technically what they're called. And essentially what that is we showed earlier the pictures of like the chevron type. These are much more abrasive and more crushing of the stem, I guess you would say. One of the major differences is going to be cost. They are quite pricey. The second thing is going to be replacement. You do see much quicker trade out in terms of needing to replace these rolls. And so, interestingly enough, we were contacted by one of the companies to kind of run a side-by-side trial with our double conditioner and their intensive conditioning system, so that not necessarily we could say that one is better than the other, but so that they could compare their dry down rate and their forage quality, because potentially there could be a reduction in forage quality if there's some bruising of that crop. They could compare that to our double conditioning system. So they could say, this dries down as quickly as the Heston Twin Max or whatnot. But what we really wanted to look at as a company is roller wear, because we are very convinced that our rollers are going to last years longer than these intensive conditioning systems.
Is there a study yet to be done, or you've already done it?
No, we were contacted by them, so hopefully this upcoming year we'll have the means to do that. Yep. But doing a roller wear conditioning study, like, who wants to do that? That's a lot of time in the seat.
Reasonable wrap. What do you, does Echo have a product, or do you use it? What do you think of it?
No comment. No, I'm just kidding. The B wrap. Yeah, no. So we don't have a comparable product to the B wrap. So that's a John Deere product. But honestly, I haven't been around it, Jimmy, just to give you a super honest answer. But I will say that in my few years of experience, I believe very strongly that we have some excellent hay producers in the United States. And I think that where we fall short is hay storage. I think that you guys are putting up fantastic hay. And then how many times do we see bales in a line with no cover or anything on it? And so I think that anything that provides any sort of a solution to reduce the dry matter losses and the weathering effects of our bales, of our round bales in particular, is something worth looking at. And so that also comes into play the Fendt Rotana, which we were talking about with Chris earlier, how that can give us an option in the next couple of years. So it's on the market in Europe. It'll be over here probably next year. And it will do a film binding. So instead of net wrap, we're going to have film that is impenetrable by water to be on the outside of the bale. So in turn, also allowing storage solution, but also allowing the sweat of the bale to still come out because the outside is still open. It's not completely enclosed.
Would that be still line the bales up in a row, close together, or would you spread them out a little bit so you didn't have moisture gather between it? Just that wrap on the outside.
I think, I'm guessing, he asked about lining the bales up. How would we store it then? I'm guessing, so we don't know yet, but I'm thinking that we're probably still going to line them up end to end. That way we can help the reduction of any sort of water infiltration. But I think that we'll probably still have enough air permeability for the sweat after it's baled. That's my guess, but I haven't even seen the baler yet. So yes, yeah. So my two main brands are Massey Ferguson and Fendt.
In the past, we had a wrapper, if that's what you want to call it, that only wrapped the external part of the bale. And my experience with that was that no matter where you set the bale, unless you set it in the barn somewhere, as wet as this climate, in this area is, you're going to get water into the bottom, up and above the, what you want to stay dry is going to hold water, and it's not going to be able to let it out in that type system. So if it was me, and this is what I do, we wrap all of our dry hay, even if it's just crunchy dry. It gets run through the wrapper with the same amount of plastic. And I had it wrote down in my notes, but I didn't say it, but about a 4 inch, I'm only gaining about 4 inches every time a spool comes around with the wrapper. We're running an Anderson's what we're running. So we're only gaining about 4 inches and running 2 spools on it. And everybody was talking about how many layers. I'm the crazy guy that'll take a pocket knife and cut a square out of a bale of hay and try to separate the films. And I'm somewhere in around 8 layers is what we're running.
You're storing dry hay outside, you're wrapping it like bales to make sure that it can get.
And do you do it right away?
On dry hay, I mean, I'll do it fairly quickly because I want it to maintain that nice green color. But the reason that I'm willing to spend that on a dry bale of hay is simply because of the fact that I don't know if anybody else has been pricing fertilized this morning with all the current events and everything. But a month ago, I run the numbers on removal rates, and we had approximately $44 a ton in NP&K wrapped up at those current market prices. And that's based off of AGR1 removal rates on fescue hay. And that didn't pay the farmer anything for land use, machinery costs, fuel, any of that sort of thing. So
You didn't want to waste a pound of that hay.
if I'm going to waste hay, I want it out there in the pasture, unrolled out there in the field where it can decomp and put something back into the soil. I sure don't want to waste it around a bale bunk or somewhere where I've got to haul it out, with a manure spreader. I want to do it where the livestock can do the spreading.
And Chris, you did some figures on value of fertilizer and hay from fertilizer prices back in December. It was $78.
Yeah, about $80 a ton.
And I was doing mine in, I guess, late December for January meetings, and I come up to $88 a ton in value. So he and I have not talked, and we're coming up with the same numbers. So
Means we're both wrong.
I see Jimmy shaking his head, so we're right.
My neighbor said he drafted in some dry hay and showed up today and got that much on the outside.
What percent moisture do
I've
you
got another neighbor
bear?
drafted all his hay, and he never talked about having it. So I don't know.
Year one, I might just see a little discoloration just underneath the plastic. Year 2, year 3, I could expect to see about 1 inch or so. And I've actually got some dry hay there that we're feeding on right now that's 2 years old, and you couldn't tell it wasn't baled this year. So for the investment, yes, we may be losing, but no storage situation is perfect. I mean, hay starts looking old in a barn at some point. So I leave it at that same 8 layers because, you're still dealing with varmints and critters and that crawl up on the bale wrap and that sort of thing.
Chris,
I had a question on whether the color of the silage film makes a difference.
I get that question all the time.
Do you have an answer for it?
No.
There,
Asking me all the questions that I don't have an answer for.
there was.
I don't know.
We typically use white because that's what's most common. I have been told that black is something about the moisture being, or the heat being reflected off versus being absorbed in. I've never personally used black, but I have used the light green material, and I really like it, and I wish some of the suppliers around here would carry, or I need to remember to order the light green material when I get mine. It seemed like to me that the critters kind of weren't as attracted to that pale green color that kind of blends into the background, whereas white lines, 200-300 bales long, seems like it's a landing strip for certain things. So I could see where that would be of an advantage.
Craig, I was worried you were going to say that you can't glue the critters, come after or something like that.
Okay, so you're going to leave here today knowing nothing because I heard the exact opposite of what he said in terms of, and who knows, right? So I heard for like in hot climates to use the white, but whenever it is cold, like if you're trying to do an early April silage, so you need some sort of heat generation to get that fermentation process going, right? And if you're doing an early April silage, or one year, this is where my question came from, the like sweet hay. One year we had a lot of extra fall growth, and my dad and I made hay right around Thanksgiving in Maryland. So it was cold. It was very cold. And we wrapped it, and honest to goodness, I think it just sat there. Nothing happened. It was like 50% moisture grass that we gave the cows. And I'm wondering if we had used some sort of a black plastic that was actually helped to absorb the heat, if that would have helped. I don't know. But that is what I've heard in terms of different colors of plastic. Whenever we did that April study in France, we did use black plastic.
You inoculate that agent.
Mm-mm.
That was what I was going to add, that we have done at least one study with fall fescue, and with inoculation, we had perfect fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
Without it, we had none. It was just wet hay.
Just sat there. Yep.
Was it put in cold temps and stayed in cold temps?
Well, it was fall fescue, so it had to be November-ish when there was long enough to cut. I don't remember the date.
But if you feed it that winter, just like you put it in the fridge or freezer, it doesn't matter.
That's exactly what we did too.
Let it go to the next summer, that would be the worst.
Yep.
Back here.
I want to throw a curve at everybody. We deal with just horse people. That's all we do is put up a small square. And we're on a hay farm, and I've seen where, I don't know how they're wrapping it, but they've had these 21 bale bundles that were wrapped. And a lot of people, I've seen them buying these big 3x3 bags that are wrapped for horses. Has any study been done on what effect that's having on that dry hay and what it does? So that was perfectly cured hay, so probably 16, 17, and then wrapped with plastic.
Well, they also, there's a big hay producer in Michigan, looking at his name, and he's wrapping about 30% moisture, and making the sweet hay, big square bales, wrapping them, and then he, throughout the rest of the year, he grinds that up and puts it in plastic bags and sells it as a moist hay, low dust content. I mean, in essence, it's a low moisture silage. And, he sells that to a lot of horse folks. But normally, we can't even talk about anything that's in sile when we're talking to horse people because they're so worried about watching this.
Let's talk about dry hay, though. I want to follow up with Craig and Jessica. The 21, banded together bale. Would you be nervous about that in our humid environment? And also 3x3 hay, the mid-sized bale.
So
We bought some 21 bale bundles. Yeah. That actually had preservatives put on it. And you're going to get sometimes 2 or 3 bales in the middle of that that's molded.
We have the farm, they have the bale man that does that, puts together those 21 bales. They just make a comment, they're going to make sure it's really good and dry.
yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say. So I work primarily with commercial hay operations in the western U.S., and a lot of these guys are about maybe 30-70 in terms of domestic sales and exports. And that's how we're exporting a lot of hay, is in those bundles and also with compressed hay. And that's really the name of the game. So it's easy to get 8% hay in the western United States a lot of times. But even in those extremely, extremely dry hay conditions, they will still say that their customers, their export customers, whether they're working with brokers or farms directly in Asia or whatever the case may be, they will still say that they get complaints of mold. And I think probably the answer or the solution to a wide gamut of problems is going to be some sort of inoculant on a very dry hay. Typically, we're using some sort of additive on like a not so dry hay to make it better in quality. But I think that it may be the combination of extreme dryness with some sort of additive that's going to inhibit that mold growth. That may be the only answer, because we are seeing, even in the Western United States, the same problem with the interior either of a 3x3 or 4x4 bale, or those bundles, or even the compressed hay where there's just mold. I mean, it's a biological product, so it's tough to get it perfect whenever it comes to stuff like that. Well, some sort of a preservative, an additive. Yep. 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 Well, that's why it's good to have a couple old brood cows out there that just will eat anything. Yeah, but if you think about customer base, a lot of times the customers that are buying the compressed hay and the hay bundles are not cow-calf operations. That's where we run into the issues.
But looking at the change of equipment that I've just been exposed to over in my career, which is getting strung out over more years than it seems like it should. I remember some Vermeer balers that Grandpa had that just, it didn't matter what you do, it just kind of kicked out a pretty loose bale, and they used to roll hay that now if I baled it with my baler, it would definitely mold. But that's just the progression of time, and the balers, the density is so much better. What they used to get away with as far as baling moisture is completely unacceptable to me if I'm going to try to put it up as dry hay. So that's something to keep in mind too. And when you're talking about large square packages or compressed bale packages, that's even exaggerated even more.
So if there are no other questions from you guys, I will ask you all a question. Is there anything that equipment companies today are lacking? We talked about improvements in conditioning systems and different types of baling options. Is there a problem on your operation that there is just not a solution to at this point? Don't tell me to dry your hay down faster, because I can only do so much, but.
I'll answer.
Okay.
One of the things we lack at the university level right now is expertise in machinery setup and maintenance. We don't have that in Kentucky.
Mhm.
So we need more people from companies that are experts in that kind of information to help us with educational programs.
Okay, yeah.
Really to do a good job at what you gave a great demonstration in your slide about setting the roller. Not many people really know how to do that. Not maybe people in this room, but not many producers that are using blower conditioners.
Yep. Yep. You got two. Good. Yes. Mhm.
To me, that's one big item. Is a smaller, lay after each swath, and a wide swath. Today, we don't really
Right.
One thing. Second thing is baling capacity.
In terms of throughput?
Throughput. To make good quality horse hay, especially with alfalfa, is a pretty small window each day to do that. And we need to be able to get over it and get over it quick.
Okay.
Single weather today is limited. You gotta add 2, 3, 4 balers. And what we, with the current, what weather capacities are today.
What size balers are you running?
John Deere 348. That's a problem right there. 50, 70. As fast as the cost per weather
Mm-hmm.
on the market.
Right.
The market just doesn't have fast enough weather or high enough capacity weather.
It's definitely a challenge more with square balers than round balers for obvious reasons in terms of the mechanics of the plunger and things. But yeah, I completely agree. I will. The swather comment, it is a real problem. And so, especially in this part of the United States, because you get incredible crop damage if you drive over what you just mowed. So the goal is for the tires to go right in between. But then you're getting, especially if you're at a 16-foot head, which is what this one is, you're getting 16-foot worth of crop in one narrow windrow. What's it going to do? It's probably going to sit there and start to rot. Yeah. Yeah. It's just going to sit there. So, yeah, maybe we'll hook a tether to the back of that thing.